Hello and welcome to Military 101. My name is Brother Logan Isaac, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the different forces that made up the Roman military. If you've already seen my Roman legions video, you know that the military or the militia is made up of sort of four different branches. We have the watchmen or the firemen of Rome. Then we have the cohorts urbani, which is like the police force made up of the plebeian commoners. And then we had the praetors, the equestrians that protected Caesar. But this video is going to be about the cohorts legionum, or the army, essentially. And so each soldier is called a milites, which is where we get militia, where they all come together. And the milites were what we would now call legionaries. The legionaries are a specific force within Rome. All of Rome's forces were made up or were structured after legions, cohorts, and centuries, which I talk about in my legions video. But there were different types of forces that then became centuries or cohorts or legions. The legionaries were light-skinned peninsular Italians made up of citizens, and they served a maximum of 25 years. If they went through and served their entire time, maybe they rose up the ranks, maybe they didn't. At the end of their service, they would get a land grant, and they would then be given land in a veteran colony where for the last 5 years of their military service obligation, they would train new recruits. At the end of that 5 years, they would then be done. Their formal obligation would be over. They'd get their land, and they got all the money that they accumulated while they were in service. They spoke Latin. They may have spoken Greek, but again, they were light-skinned. This is what you might think of when you think of like Roman soldiers or Roman legionaries. But that is distinguished from these other groups. The legionaries were not allowed to marry while they were in service, and so that created vice economies of sex workers and contraband vendors that followed them places. And so the legionaries were not ideal for local situations because, for example, in Judea, they didn't want the legionaries because of the vice economies that they brought with them. And the Israelites didn't want, to sully up the Holy Land with these sex workers and, foreign oppressors. And so it made more sense for Rome to employ a second kind of military force. And that is what we call the auxilia. These are the auxiliaries who are recruited from local regions, who were allowed to marry and had a modicum of autonomy or normal human life outside of duty. If you were a legionary 24/7, you were a legionary. You couldn't marry. The best people you knew were the people of your tent, and that made you more mobile. And you would go off and fight the emperor's wars and defend the borders and put down insurrections for 20 years before you became a veteran and trained new recruits for 5 years. Auxilia were allowed to marry, and so that made them less mobile. They were also more familiar with their own local customs, culture, law, politics, and so those two things, their less than mobility and their connection to the local norms and mores made them excellent made them excellent candidates for policing activities. And so the auxilia were also darker skinned. They're not Italian. They weren't citizens. In fact, a lot of auxilia joined up for food, clothing, housing, salary, and at the end of their service, the promise of citizenship and the legal protections that it afforded as Roman citizens, and entering essentially the plebeian class, even though you might be in some of the remote provinces. So the auxilia, again, are darker skinned, locally recruited, and they probably spoke Greek as the lingua franca throughout the land, as well as their own local dialect or local language. Then on the far end of the spectrum, at the end, we have the numeri. And the numeri literally means the masses. Numeri were semi-autonomous forces loyal to a remote client kingdom or king. And the numeri, they had almost no interest or motivation to be Roman. Their main prerogative was to their own king. And that is how Rome exercised some amount of control over them. Client kings like Herod and his sons Archelaus and Antipas They had things from Rome that they wanted. But Rome allowed them to use their own forces, maintain their own forces, hire their own forces, and this is what we call the numeri, or the masses. They could be called upon to help put down insurrections or defend borders, fill in the blank, but they're not Roman. They have no interest in being Roman, and they have kind of their own thing that they're doing. They're not paid by Rome. It's all mediated through the local king. And so the numeri, the auxilia, and the legionary, these are the basic forces that make up the Roman military. They're each distinct. They each have their own interests, motivations, and backgrounds. And so it's important not to confuse them, because Rome didn't use them the same way, and they didn't see themselves in relationship to Rome in the same way that we might think of them. If you have any more questions, or you want to learn more or hire me for a more in-depth workshop, go to pewpewhq.com or subscribe to my Substack, where I write about this stuff about weekly, and where you can continue to support my work.